Please welcome him, Dr. Andy Aldrin.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here in Nepal, your beautiful country, and I'm enjoying it for a while. And I think one of the messages that I want to get across to all of you out there is that there are amazing things that are being done in space today, and I think that all of you will have the opportunity to participate in it. I spent most of my career working for large aerospace companies like Joe and Beth, big companies that do billion-dollar programs, and we do amazing things in space. But I left United Launch Alliance, which was the company which actually built the rockets that you saw launching the Orion spacecraft, the big, huge rockets. Those rockets cost hundreds of millions of dollars. I left those companies to run a company that was building a very small spacecraft. We were going to fly a spacecraft to the moon for $30 million. That is about 1/10, one order of magnitude less than what a typical unmanned mission would cost. So the message is that you can actually do amazing things for a lot less money than we did things for in the past. And I think this opens up educational opportunities for all of you. It opens up business opportunities. And I'm going to talk about some of the things that we're doing at the Florida Institute of Technology along those lines that should demonstrate the capabilities of doing what I'll call small space, but doing meaningful things that have to do with education, inspiring things that let you participate in space in ways that smaller universities can support, smaller nations can support. So let me give you a couple of examples of countries I've visited. Just recently I was in Peru, and they invited me to come and talk with them about what it is that Peru could actually do in space. Now, Peru is a small nation. I don't know exactly what their GDP is, their gross domestic product, compared to Nepal. It's probably larger, but it's a small country. But Peru has produced two spacecraft, small spacecraft, but these spacecraft are actually capable of detecting electromagnetic pulses that come from the Earth that may be able to predict earthquakes. Okay, that's pretty incredible stuff for a relatively small nation. So I think one of the points is small nations can contribute in space. Another nation that I visited many years ago called the Republic of Kiribati. You probably don't know. It's a small island nation with about 75 islands in the Pacific Ocean. They were very close to actually building a launch site for Japan back in the late 90s. The country's gross domestic product was about $66 million, and they were going to build a launch site for Japan. Now, the deal fell apart for other reasons, but the point is even very small nations can have something to do with space. So that's my basic message for the first part. In the second part of my talk, I want to talk a little bit more about Mars, what we're doing to get to Mars. But again, part of the message is that all of you in this room, I believe, can participate in meaningful ways to put humans on Mars permanently. So let's talk about some of the things we're doing at Florida Tech. Christina? Okay, there are three things that are happening today that are changing space in some very fundamental ways, and in fundamental ways that are going to enable us to do things for about an order of magnitude less money than what we did them for in the past. Let me give you one of the examples from my time running Moon Express. When I was running Moon Express, we built a rocket engine, absolutely from the start to the finish in about 4 months, and for about $400,000. Now, if this were going to be done in a typical aerospace company like the ones I work for, like the ones Joe works for, it would take about 4 years and would cost about $4 billion to build a new rocket engine. Maybe $400 million, let's say. Okay, it's a very simple engine that we built, but the point is, by having a small group of very dedicated people, doing things maybe without as much testing as you would normally have with an engine, we were able to do something pretty incredible. We actually developed a lunar lander demonstrator vehicle in about 4 months. Okay, this kind of thing is just impossible to do in a very large aerospace company with very large amounts of government oversight. So I think what's happening in the small commercial space industry right now is going to change the way we do space and change it in ways that enable us to do things for a lot less money. Next chart, please. Second thing I want to talk about is miniaturization. So these are spacecraft that were built by Planet Labs. They built these things for a couple $100,000. These spacecraft orbit the Earth and they take pictures of the Earth. They actually, you may see sometimes pictures of your own country from space that are getting taken by spacecraft like these. These kinds of spacecraft in the past may have cost hundreds of millions of dollars, and they're building these things for hundreds of thousands. Now, instead of 2 large spacecraft, Planet Labs orbits many smaller spacecraft, and they're able to get a lot of temporal resolution by having a lot of spacecraft. So they can do some things you really can't do with a single large spacecraft. But they're doing it at far lower cost than before. Next chart. Globalization. So it wasn't long ago that you really had about 4 or 5 countries in space that were doing anything serious. There's the United States, Soviet Union, China, and Europe, and Japan. Today, there are 50 countries with space programs. Now, a lot of what the developing countries are doing in space isn't necessarily building spacecraft. A lot of what they're doing is actually just building the systems on the ground that are receiving data, that are processing data. And to be honest with you, most of the money that's to be made in space is going to be made by companies that are doing things on the ground, not just building space hardware. Next chart. Okay, so these are some of the things that we're doing at Florida Tech. Florida Tech is located about 30 miles, call it 50 kilometers, away from the Kennedy Space Center, where we launched the majority of spacecraft in the United States. So it's natural that we would have our own rocket programs. We do small rockets. That's not a big rocket. The thing really only goes a couple thousand feet up into space. But what we do is we actually take this rocket to the Kennedy Space Center and launch it off of what we call the range. And students actually get the experience of launching something from the same place that we're launching some of the biggest spacecraft that are launched today. Same place where we launched Joe's Orion vehicle. Next chart. Time capsule to Mars is a very small, we call it a CubeSat. It's about the size of this, to be honest with you. It may be a little shorter and a little wider, but it's going to Mars, and it's going to land on Mars. And the amazing thing about this program is it's all done by college students. There are no professors even involved in this thing. And they're organizing themselves, and they're raising their own money. And I'm very proud to have some Florida Tech students involved in this program. It's really cool stuff that you can do. And we're doing it at American universities today. And some of you could come and study it if you want to. Next chart. CubeSats. So I talked about CubeSats before. We're building some of our own fairly sophisticated CubeSats that are doing Earth observation, doing other experimentation in space. And if you come to not just Florida Tech, but almost any American university is going to have CubeSat programs. In Peru, they're developing CubeSat programs. I very much believe that in the future in Nepal, you will be developing CubeSat programs. These things are conceivable. They're possible to do for thousands of dollars, not millions of dollars. Next chart. Spaceloft is a very small launch vehicle. We're able to buy this launch. We don't buy the launch vehicle. We actually buy a launch service. We send it up. It actually doesn't go in orbit around the Earth. It just goes up and down, but enables us to do microgravity research experiments. It tests a lot of things that you might want to do in space, and then you go on to fly them on the space station. I'll talk about some things we're doing on the space station as well. Very cool stuff. Next chart. We're also flying people on what are called zero gravity missions. So what happens is you get in a normal airplane, you go up, and then you go down. If you've ever noticed in an airplane when you go down really fast, it feels like you're floating, right? You're in zero gravity. And so you can actually do some experiments on this zero-G vehicle that requires some human interaction with the experiment. So that's another cool thing that you can do for a very little amount of money. Next chart. Okay, so we're actually flying experiments on the space station. Our students are flying real stuff on the space station that is real science that makes a huge difference. In fact, some of the things that we've done on the space station have had an impact on launch vehicles and programs that I was working on when I was at Boeing. We actually had to sit a launch vehicle on the launch pad for a while people were doing experiments at Florida Tech telling us how our vehicle needed to operate. College students telling us, the big Boeing company, what we needed to do. I mean, you can have an impact. Next chart. So this is another experiment we're flying. We just flew on the space station. This experiment was trying to determine how life originally formed in the universe. And one of the questions was, does life form in zero gravity more readily than it forms in gravity? And the experiment was to grow protein crystals, primordial organic protein crystals, on the space station and grow the same crystals on the Earth. And we frankly expected that most protein crystals grow much more quickly in zero gravity. What happened was exactly the opposite. Protein crystals grew more rapidly on the ground. That's kind of an amazing scientific achievement. And again, it's something that we're doing with college students today. You don't have to be, a big-time academic to do this kind of stuff or work for a huge aerospace company. Next chart. Okay, so now let's talk about big space a little bit. What we're doing at the Aldrin Space Institute is probably building the plans for the greatest endeavor that humanity will undertake for the next 100 years. We talk a lot about what my dad did, walking on the moon, but in 1,000 years, the history books about humanity will have about one line about Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin walking on the moon. Those same history books will have an entire chapter about humanity moving from the Earth to actually live and prosper on another planet. What we're doing at the Buzz Aldrin Institute is developing those plans. I would like to think that we are writing the first lines of that history book that's going to be written in 1,000 years from now. So it's big stuff. And it's an honor to be a part of it. But I think one of the most important things that we believe about humanity going to Mars is we must go there as a human race. It's not going to be the United States. It's going to be many nations participating. And I think all nations are going to have an opportunity to participate in this. So let me give you another, thank you. Let me give you another example of what a small nation can do. Again, I'm going to go back to Peru. So in this workshop, we talked about, someone from Peru in the audience. In this workshop, we talked about how can Peru possibly contribute anything to a human mission to put people permanently on Mars. Well, as it turns out, we started talking, and there's an area in Peru called the Atacama Desert, which is incredibly dry, but very, very much like Mars. In fact, it's probably more like Mars than any place on the Earth today. And we devised some experiments that we could do to simulate not just humans operating on Mars, Mars, but actually the kinds of things that you would build on Mars to sustain life, to grow plants. And as it turns out, Peru is the perfect place to do that. So just there's something that they can do to contribute. And I think that, if we got the right people together, we can probably come up with things that Nepal could contribute over time. So I think this is something to talk about. Next up. Okay, so when we talk about Mars, before I was talking about doing small things for hundreds of thousands of dollars. When we're talking about going to Mars, we are talking about literally hundreds of billions of dollars over decades of time. We're going to have a series of spacecraft that are going to be orbiting between the Earth and Mars, and from Mars to the Earth, much as a satellite orbits the Earth today. So when you send a satellite out into orbit, once it gets into orbit, it doesn't require any additional energy. It will continue orbiting the Earth forever, or at least until the slight amount of atmospheric drag brings it down. My dad, I think in one of his greatest achievements, has developed a system of spacecraft that will orbit between Earth and Mars that is truly revolutionary. So our approach to putting humans on Mars builds around that aspect of the architecture. And so I think it's something that's absolutely revolutionary. And as we look at the architecture today, we see that there are some critical problems that need to get solved. These are critical problems, some of which require a lot of money, but most of them don't. So I want to go through some of the key areas that we're looking at. And it's not the typical things you think about, like rocket engines. So let's go to the first chart. Okay, this one is a little bit like rocket engines, but when you go to Mars, it requires, for every trip that you go there, about 1 million pounds, 1 million kilograms of propellant to go there. If you go there, if you try to take 1 million kilograms of propellant, you basically will take 10 of the largest launch vehicles we will ever have just to get the fuel into orbit to take us to Mars. If you get that propellant off of the moon, it would transform the way we actually do transportation in space. And as it turns out, the moon has lots of propellant, rocket fuel on the moon. It's rocket fuel in the form of ice. Ice is oxygen and hydrogen, the two components of rocket fuel. One of the things that we're trying to figure out right now at the Aldrin Space Institute is how do you get the propellant, how do you get the ice off of the moon? How do you turn it into, how do you vaporize it? How do you turn it into propellant? How do you store the propellant? How do you transfer the propellant? And these are all just these are studies that we can do at a university. They don't require huge investments in money, but they are things that need to happen right now. And I think we're doing some interesting work with NASA on this. Next chart, please. Complicated. In many ways, it's more challenging than the moon, because if we go to the moon, the next food on the moon is only 3 or 4 days away. It takes about 3 or 4 days to get from the Earth to the moon. To get to Mars, it takes about 6 months, and you can only go there once every 2 years. If we are going to sustain people, we have to be able to grow things on Mars. It's going to take much different habitation systems. There's radiation protection and things that we have to look at. So we're starting to look at habitation systems at the Aldrin Space Institute. Next chart. Now this is an area where we are doing cutting-edge research for very small amounts of money. So I talked about the importance of growing plants on Mars in order to sustain life. We're actually growing lettuce and other vegetables in a simulated Mars regolith today. And I believe we are the only people in the U.S. that are doing this kind of work. We're working with NASA very closely. And you can see most of the experiments that we're looking at, except for the one that's actually on Mars there, most of the experiments that we're looking at are things that are really very cheap to do. And so we're doing this for thousands of dollars, literally. But if we don't solve some of these problems today, in a decade when we're really starting to plan for living on Mars, we're not going to know what we can grow or how we can grow it. So it's very important to do this kind of research up front and early, and it doesn't cost a great deal of money. Next chart. Okay, this is a really interesting area. So when people are on the space station. They've been on the space station for about a year. They're constantly talking to people back home. If they need to get home really quickly, the requirement is, I think you need to be able to deliver people within 3 hours or something like that, get them back from the space station in an emergency. If you're on Mars, you're not getting home for 3 years at best. When we talk about putting people on Mars at the Aldrin Space Institute, we're talking about putting people on Mars for decades. When you put people together in a small enclosed area and they have to work together under very stressful conditions, strange things happen. Next chart. People get weird. And actually the research that we found is that people in Antarctica tend to have real social problems when they really realize that they're stuck there over the Antarctic winter. And so one of the most important things that we're looking at is understanding the mental health of astronauts that are going to be on Mars, understanding how people are going to interact together. Because I know my dad will tell you this, and I think he's right. You got that, Dad? I said you're right. Okay. That the human mental health may be one of the most difficult challenges humanity is going to face in moving to and living on Mars. I mean, at some point there'll be a prosperous society, but the first settlers there are going to have a very difficult time. And we are doing some very early research, but trying to look at this problem very early on, because I think dealing with human factors is going to be one of the most important problems we're going to face going to Mars. Next chart, please. Okay, I want to talk just a little bit about something new that we're doing at Florida Tech. We have just turned in a proposal to create what's called the Heinlein Institute at Florida Institute of Technology. This is a graduate studies program, and what it is students will go to any one of 6 different universities listed here for a master's degree in their standard course curricula, whether that's engineering, business management, education. They'll take their standard course curricula, they'll get a certificate in commercial space from Florida Tech, and the programs that we're going to do are going to be very high-intensity programs at the Kennedy Space Center, where we are going to turn out not just the smartest and the best entrepreneurs in space in the future, but we are going to be investing in some of the projects that these people are going to be doing. So we'll actually be creating commercial space business out of the Institute. It's something that we're very excited about doing. We're actually going to be starting the program in 2018. I think I have one more chart. Right, so the program isn't just about teaching courses in a summer program. It's actually a 360-degree program where, in addition to just classical studies, you're going to be participating in launches, you're going to be participating in workshops, there will be research seminars. So the idea is students coming into this program are going to have a constant experience with commercial space throughout their entire period at the university, as well as their own graduate studies. So with that, I want to say, look, the future is about all of you in Nepal, all of you around the world. It's really about the best young people working together to create what I think is going to be an amazing future for all of us in space. So thank you very much for having me.